So it's not only possible to do confidence intervals by hand, but it's also possible to calculate them using the calculator. So here I am back with example 1, and we already discussed when we did this by hand why this is a z-interval. So let's talk about how to calculate that on the calculator. All I have to do actually is go to stat and then tests, and you want number 7. It's called z-interval. So notice when you go to number 7, you have a choice of data or stats. You would use data if you had a list of numbers. So if you had a list of numbers, you could actually enter it in under stat and edit. So you could enter it into L1, and then you could go back here and you could calculate a confidence interval based off that. You would have to know sigma though, right? Because to do a z-interval, you have to know sigma, and sigma cannot be calculated from a sample. But here we actually have statistics because we already have calculated sample means and sample standard deviations. So I press stats and then enter. Now it asks for sigma, not S, right? We happen to know in that case, in this case that we know that, and it's 14. X bar is 150. N in this case is 60. And we want a 0.90 for our confidence level. So all I do now is go to calculate, and I get 147.03 up to 152.97. So that would be my actual answer here. And so I could just put that down as my final result. But the question is, if you write this down as your confidence interval, how do you answer questions like, what's the margin of error? How do you answer questions like, what's the point estimate? Well, we already know the point estimate comes from here. So it's the sampling. So 150, you're done with that. But the question is, what's the margin of error? Well, actually, the margin of error is the distance between these two numbers over 2. Because the way that this was calculated was you added something, the margin of error, and you got 152.97. You subtracted something, the margin of error, and you got 147.03. So that means that this is 2 standard errors across. If that's the case, then what I can do is say the margin of error would be 152.97 minus 147.03 divided by 2. And when I calculate that, I get the same thing we had before when we did it by hand, 297. And so I didn't have to actually touch a formula if I do this method with the confidence interval. So let's take a look at what a t-interval would look like if I was to do the same thing. In example 2, we discussed why this is a t-interval. So now all we got to do is actually calculate it just as we did a second ago. So I go to stat, I go to test, and this time actually I want to go to number 8. You can either type the number 8 or you can scroll down and see. Number 8, t-interval. And notice this time t-interval asks for S. That's because here you're assuming to have only a sample standard deviation. Anytime you have a list of data, you should be using a t-interval. And in that case, you just press enter, and notice all it does is ask for the list. Okay, so I highlight stats, press enter. X bar in this case is 540.15. S in this case is 86.9. N is 41, and we have 0.95 as our confidence level. So I go to calculate. It takes a second because the t-distribution is actually a little more complicated. And I get my result of 512.72, comma, 567.58. So this would be my answer. Obviously, I would interpret it, etc., but all the calculations done within the calculator.